Join us by the fireside for our evening tales of true life's strange experiences with things that lie beyond the veil of the known and into the misty depths of the mysterious and unknown.
A demonic doll. So, just to give a little bit of a backstory, I've experienced paranormal situations since I can remember, and not just me, but also my older sister. So, first off, my sister had seen apparitions when she was really small, and she had been tormented by this little girl that would scare her. And a couple of years ago, while sightseeing in Seattle, we went into a psychic store, and the cashier had described the exact details on the appearance of the little girl that had been following my sister around. And this just freaked her out. And also, since I was quite small, I would have these really in depth, creepy, bizarre dreams that would feel as though I had lived hundreds of other people's lives and had seen countless different types of shadow beings that I had different names for when I was really small, such as shadow blobs, which I believed were just aimlessly roaming around and mostly harmless. There were demon shadows, there were crawlers, and there was this weeping fog kind of thing. So, anyway, I would kind of just break these down and explain, but I'll save that for maybe some other time since this story doesn't revolve around these particular things. But I just wanted to mention that I grew up with, where paranormal experiences were relatively common and normal to me. And basically, they still are a part of my daily life, to be honest. This particular event took place when I was in early middle school. So it was around 13 years ago, and it was about this time I had a best friend who is actually still my best friend to this day, and her name was Mona. Now, we would go from staying at Mona's house one week to my house the next, and on this specific week, we happened to be staying at her house. So, one very odd similarity we always noticed about either of our houses was there were certain areas of both of our houses that were unusually colder than the rest of the house. And when I say unusual, I mean that it was so unusual that the first time visitors always came, they would never fail to mention that, the temperature difference at both our houses. And at my house, it was the basement. And at Laurie's house, it happened to be her living room that was the coldest. At this point in time, I had already stayed the night at Laurie's house, on a number of times, and we would always sleep in this living room. I would always be the last one to fall asleep since I struggled with really bad nightmares that happened almost every night, like I mentioned earlier. So I was the only one awake to hear things fall and hit the ground in the kitchen right next to the living room, or even see things fall from the coffee table that was only a few feet away from the spot on the floor where I happened to be laying down at the time. And not only that, I would also notice these temperature drops, and I would get this overwhelming sense that I was being watched, to which I would cover my head up with my blanket and just close my eyes and hope that it would go away before I would finally fall asleep. So on this particular day, it was around late evening, and Mona and I were at her house alone, and one of our friends that lived close by had just come over. I'll call her Kara. And Mona was telling us about this creepy plastic doll she had that had a button on its back, and when pressed, it would sing the Ring Around the Rosie song. So I asked her where the doll was, to which she said it was in her garage, which the door to the garage, by the way, bordered between the living room and the kitchen. So, wanting to see it, Mona and I went into the garage while Kara, uninterested, went outside just on the other side of the garage door that was down at the time. Mona's garage was used more like a storage space and was really cluttered with boxes full of all different kinds of toys and things and books, etc. And so after digging for a while, we finally found the doll, which was in pretty poor condition. It had short blonde hair that was matted into pigtails, and it had a stained pink frilly dress. And as soon as Mona pressed the button, it started in a normal little girl's voice. Ring around the. And at this point, its voice got deeper and it started to stutter. I looked at Mona, horrified, who also looked back at me in complete shock, and she said, "It's never done this before." And at the last sentence, it sounded faded, almost like two voices were saying the same thing in sync. Before it finished the last word, with a pause, the lights in the garage flickered and went out. And just before we could react, the doll roared the last word in the most deep, and I'm not kidding, demonic sounding voice that still gives me chills thinking about it. It said, "Down!" I could hear Mona dropping the doll, and we practically tripped over ourselves and the boxes around us as we ran in pitch black darkness to the door leading back into her house. And I remember panicking and screaming at Mona in front of me, "Turn on the lights and open the door, Mona!" And Mona yelled back, "I'm trying! The lights won't turn on and the door won't open. It's locked!" I could hear her frantically flipping the light switch up and down as well as the door handle, jiggling as she desperately tried to turn the doorknob. And in the midst of our yelling, we could hear the doll start to sing again in the demonic voice. "Ring around the roses." At this point, we were pounding on the door and both screaming, "Kara! Kara! Open the door, please!" Repeatedly shouting Kara's name. I remember feeling like the temperature dropped drastically suddenly, as well as this overwhelming feeling of pure horror and dread, like something really bad was just about to happen to us. And as our poundings on the door got more frantic, the door suddenly flew open, with Kara on the other side of it, staring at us, annoyed and confused. And we just pushed past her, causing her to stumble back, and I slammed the garage door and instantly locked it. And all three of us just stood there in stunned silence for a moment, the only sound being Mona and my labored panting when Kara yelled, "What the hell are you guys screaming about?" And Mona and I tried to explain to her what happened. Well, we tried anyway. It was difficult at first because we were both just bawling our eyes out, and she thought that we were playing a joke on her or something. But as we kept insisting, she still didn't believe us. Mona, to this day, still doesn't like talking about it. All I know is that as soon as her dad got home, she made him take the doll out to the dumpster that very same day. That's a pretty terrifying experience. And I can't help wondering if maybe Dad should have burnt the doll instead of just throwing it in the dumpster. Because these things do have a way of finding another home and, bothering somebody else. And hopefully that doesn't happen. So it was either that this evil spirit was somehow attached to this doll, or it is attached to just anything in the house that it decides to at any moment. Anyway, pretty scary story, and just glad that you two made it out of there, because you can only wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been able to get out and there was nobody home, for example, and the door couldn't open. Doesn't bear even considering. The Hispanic Lady. One morning, I happened to wake up quite suddenly, actually, It was actually a beautiful summer morning, and the sun was just streaming in through the windows, and the curtains were blowing in this soft, gentle breeze, and I could hear birds singing outside. I had this kind of moment of just peace and relaxation. And then I turned my head and I saw a figure standing by the bed. It was a Hispanic lady, and she was dressed in this formal red dress. She looked like the actress Elizabeth Pena. She was looking down at me with this expression that I can only really describe as adoration. I remember thinking, oh no, she's confused me for someone else. And then I just kind of lay there, convinced that if I spoke, she would realize her mistake and that she would be embarrassed or something. Anyway, it was like I was kind of asleep and also partly awake or something. Because although, this woman was there and she was a stranger, I didn't feel like, really terrified or anything. Anyway, this went on for about 10 minutes or so. And this woman was looking at me like I was her, most beloved offspring or something. Then I blinked and everything was gone. It was dark, and the light of the moon on the snow outside lit up the room. It had just been a dream, a strange dream, but a dream that was nonetheless so real. Anyway, I managed to forget about it the next day as I went about my day, and so I was surprised when again, the next morning, I woke suddenly. This bright sunlight was streaming through the window, and the curtains once again were moving about in the gentle breeze as the birds sang sweetly outside. I turned to look beside me, just like the day before, and there she was again. This time she was kneeling beside the bed. Her arms were crossed on the mattress and her head resting in her arms. Again, she looked at me with such pure love and adoration that I just laid there and just kind of basked in it, although I was still sure she had mistaken me for someone else. We stayed that way even longer that time. It was maybe like 20 minutes. It just seemed forever. And then I blinked again, and I was once again in this reality where it was still night and it was winter outside. I mulled over the dream the next day, wondering what the hell did this mean? I was convinced that my subconscious was trying to tell me something, but I didn't know what. That night, I was kind of anxious to fall asleep and dream in case that happened again. And so when I woke to the sun streaming in and the curtains waving in the gentle breeze and the birds singing merrily, I thought I was prepared. I lay for a moment enjoying the sights and sounds before turning to where I knew the lady would be. And there she stood beside the bed, but this was different. She was screaming, her face screwed up in an anxious grimace. She waved her arms frantically, but no sound came from her. It was like I was watching a movie on mute. She continued to try to scream, waving her hands in a desperate pleading motion. She looked as though she was about to cry. I looked back at her in confusion, unsure what was happening. She stopped her frantic waving and looked defeated. And then a look came across her face. She raised her hands above her head and brought her fists together. Before I knew what was happening, she brought them down with all her might right at my solar plexus. I woke up, gasping, struggling to sit up, struggling to breathe, wheezing as my lungs tried to fill with air again. Back in reality, it was still night, and it was winter. Once I can breathe, I continued to sit up in bed, and I was traumatized by what just happened. I was terrified, but mostly because the lady's behavior had changed so drastically. I cannot calm myself, and so I continued to sit up, breathing slowly and deeply. And at some point, I realized that I am feeling a slight shudder in the bed, a kind of movement, every 10 or 15 seconds. I listened closely, but I cannot hear any sounds over the fan that's running in the corner. But the shudder comes again. I reach down to put my hands on the bed frame and confirm that something is indeed shaking the bed very gently. I quietly and slowly got out of bed, trailing my hand along the bed frame. I made my way to the foot of the bed. The sweater chest that's normally sitting against the footboard prevented me from keeping contact with the bed frame. But I continued to my husband's side of the bed. As I rounded the sweater chest, the moon, reflecting against the snow outside the window, offered a dim light, enough to see a dark shadow wedged between the sweater chest and the footboard. I was pretty scared at that point, but I watched as the shape twitched and shudders. My mind was not able to make sense of what I was seeing, but I was scared. And finally, thinking I must still be dreaming, I reached out to touch the shadow. It was my dog. He was trying to retrieve a toy from between the bed and the chest, but had gotten his collar caught in the decorative scrollwork of the footboard. He was twitching and shuddering because he was slowly choking to death. I screamed and awoke my husband, who ended up having to retrieve a knife to cut the collar off. He's managed to twist it perfectly around the breakaway portion so that it cannot work. We got him free, and we sat for hours holding him and crying, afraid to leave him for a moment. He survived without any issues, but I am haunted by the dream of the lady in red. Yes, I know it's very likely that my subconscious had picked up on the vibrations of my dog's struggles and crafted something in my dream to startle me awake. Except for the fact that I have suffered extremely vivid nightmares for my entire life. Had I only had the final dream, I would have done what I did every time I have a nightmare. I would have rolled over and gone back to sleep. I only stayed awake that night because the first two dreams had made me start to trust the lady. And so when she so desperately struck out at me, it bothered me on a very deep level, much deeper than any nightmare ever has before or since. So why did she come to me at all? I don't know for sure, but I believe that she did to warn me in advance because she knew that something was going to happen and that we would not have found my dog until it was too late if she hadn't intervened and warned me and woken me up in that way. That sounds almost like a guardian angel story kind of thing, warning you that something is going to happen and, getting you to wake up and just do something about it before it was too late. And sometimes I've also heard that animals can appear in dreams as in human form too, as humans. I have a friend who has a cat who actually appeared to her as a man. And he spoke to her and he said, "I'm your cat." And he was in this dream. And it was so vivid and clear. So this is fascinating. And I'm really happy to hear that your dog was fine and he doesn't have any injuries. A weird obsession with roses. I'm still not sure what to make of this experience. But anyway, it happened back in 2003 when I was on a 2-week trip to Scotland. It was a program for international students at a university. I was assigned a shared bedroom with another girl from my country. And this girl was obsessed with roses. She had roses in every single one of her clothes. She had rose pendants, rose earrings, just roses everywhere. And she was obsessed with the paranormal too. Now, going into Scotland as 13-year-olds, we were told the place was full of ghost stories and all kinds of stuff. We were just kids. So this girl was right in her zone. She started asking me to take pictures of the creepy looking basement. It was an analog camera back then, and no way I was going to waste a photo with that because someone had told her a kid had died there. These rumors just kind of get around, and, sometimes they're just made up to scare kids. So she used to tell little stories about things like that. I don't know, like spiritualism or whatever. Like how she had some sort of sixth sense. It was a long time ago, so, I don't know. Anyway, those were the two things that she was obsessed with, the paranormal and roses. One day, she told me why she was obsessed with roses. Apparently, she used to have a sister, and the child passed away very young. I think she was a toddler, maybe around 2 years old. This girl was obviously just devastated. And then one day, she claims to have looked up at the sky and said, "Sis, if you're here and you can see me, please send me a rose." And when she looked down at the ground, she found something with a rose on it. I think it was like a spoon or something. And it had this engraving on it. Anyway, me and my friends at the time, being just kids, we were just thoroughly creeped out by this kid. The story, albeit sad, didn't really help, especially for the amount of roses that she wore. I mean, seriously, it was just everywhere on everything. So one night I was sleeping in my bed and I woke up just for no reason, and I looked around and, nothing was going on. The girl was sleeping in the bed next to me. And then all of a sudden, my pillow started to get pulled just a little. I looked to the side, but she's still there, sound asleep. And my pillow just got pulled again, and then again and again, and just a little bit each time. It was like somebody was trying to snatch the pillow from under my head. I was wide awake, and I couldn't explain what the hell was happening, and I just kind of froze. I pulled my covers over to my neck, and I just waited until morning. The pillow pulling just went on for about half an hour, I think, and then it just stopped. Then came the second night, and our bedroom had a sink in it where we brushed our teeth before bed. That day, we foreign kids had decided to buy the most tourist thing we could find. It was this big kind of red hat with horns and ginger braids, because we just thought that was the most Scottish thing in the world for some reason. I had set mine on the sink and just left it there. The girl and I were talking, and this was the end of our trip. And it was like, it was the last week and we had only about 3 days left. And then we were going back home. By now, everyone was spooked by this girl, by the way. She just had this vibe. If the constant stories, the insistence on finding paranormal stuff, and her going on and on about roses and her dead sister wasn't enough, I'm saying this because by this point there was some animosity towards her. I got along all right with her, but most of the others didn't. She wasn't being excluded, but there was a weird vibe in the air, which to this day, if I try to look for a logical explanation within the paranormal one, this is the only one I can come up with. So this night, I turned around and I glanced at my, ridiculous Scottish tourist hat thing, and I swear to God, one of the braids was just floating in the air. It was like someone was pulling the ribbon and lifting it like you would a marionette. It even shuddered a little bit, like it could barely hold. At that moment, I said, "Oh, hell no." I grabbed a pillow, knocked on my friend's room, and said, "Scoot, I'm sleeping here tonight." I remember telling the girl what I had seen, and she wasn't bothered in the slightest. She was just like, "Oh, okay," and moved along. I didn't even care that I left her there. To this day, I can't explain this, and a greater part of me is honestly willing to believe I was just gullible, impressionable, 13-year-old, I don't know. But a part of me kept thinking, that was the girl's sister, wasn't it? I made fun of the roses thing, and she taunted me. For years, I stuffed that stupid hat deep inside a box, and I couldn't even look at it. I was a fully formed adult by then when I finally brought that thing out and had the courage to touch it again. I swear, for years, it was like I was expecting it to move again or something. I don't know. But I have never seen that girl again, and to be honest, I hope I never do.